the biggest attendance we've had in person for a while. And for those of you on Zoom, it was just hard to get the room to be quiet, which is good fun that we're back in person and this feels like a colloquium on Monday. So thank you for all joining us. What seems like at this point in time, hi, I'm Angie Raymond. I'm the Director of Data Management, Information Governance. And quite frankly, what seems like a million years ago, when I did a program launch, we did smart cities. And for some odd reason, I was fortunate enough for Ben Green to submit a paper and come to the workshop. And since that time, I've been fortunate to work with him for, at this point, for years, keeping to bump into him all over the place, quite honestly. And so the opportunity not only to be, part of these conversations, but also to get to see how he's evolved in ways that eliminate a lot of the sort of, let's just go with stupid, when we understand complexity of regulation and policy, and the commitment to this type of stuff is just a wonderful adventure. Today, Dr. Ben Green is going to talk to us, and I want to get the title right, Algorithmic Realism, Reimagining Data Science to Promote Social Justice. He is currently at the University of Michigan. He's held positions and fellowships all over the place. And I don't want to take up any more time. Just thank you for being here and thank you for being part of the workshop.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Angie, so much for inviting me and the kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming out. I'm glad I was able to, it's nice to have a room full of people for an in-person conversation. So that's really, really lovely. This is a talk on relatively early stage work. So I'm writing a book. I've written about 1.5 chapters out of 6 chapters, and I'm still sort of sorting through some of the key ideas, or at least how they come through. For those of you who read the chapter that I sent over, you're some of the first people to have actually read this material. So that's both a little scary and a little exciting. So these are ideas that I've been thinking about for a number of years through my dissertation and postdoc. And I'm trying to now bring this into a book that really tries to transform how data scientists think about the work that they do and what it means to actually promote justice through technology. So as that preamble suggests, the primary audience for this particular project is more on the engineering side, but I think there are a lot of policy implications of this work that I've sort of stripped away from the core of the book just for the sake of audience and clarity, but I am very interested in really thinking through how these ideas would also interact with thinking about better forms of regulation. So let's see if this will work. Great. So just to sort of very quickly set up the framing of what I'm interested in is the tension between the promises and perils of algorithms in public policy. There's, on the one hand, these great hopes for algorithms to solve social problems, and yet on the other hand, there's significant concern about how the actual deployment of these systems has led to various forms of injustice and discrimination and inequality and so on. And so there's really this central question that, at least from the perspective of data science, that the field faces of, given these issues, what can data scientists actually do to promote justice? It often feels like you can either fall into the camp of, being really excited about technology and just saying, we're going to build and, not going to worry so much about the consequences, or you can be a critic of these systems and talk about why they're flawed and why they're bad. But what is the middle ground? What do you actually do if you want to take those critics seriously, but you also do want to build systems? And that's really the goal of this project. And for me, that leads me to thinking about methodology and modes of reasoning. And sort of the starting point for the book is the argument that the existing methods that data scientists have lack the capacity to rigorously prepare data scientists to reason about the social impacts and consequences of algorithmic interventions. And so the answer to improving society with algorithms is not to simply apply existing methods to social and political challenges, but to actually reorient the methods that engineers are following. So to quickly frame what the current state of the practice is, I typologize it as a methodology called algorithmic formalism, which is an approach to reasoning about algorithms that restricts the study of algorithms to their formal mathematical attributes. It assumes that mathematical formalisms provide a complete description of algorithms and requires mathematical analysis to analyze algorithms. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that every data scientist is at every moment thinking along these lines, but I think that this captures the broad orientation of how data scientists are actually going about their day-to-day work, which shows up quite a bit through ethnographies, through the articles that data scientists write, the actual applications, their modes of evaluation, and so on. So I organize this methodology into three core orientations. The first is internalism, an assumption that we can analyze algorithms through their internal mathematical characteristics, which leads to practices of evaluating algorithms purely through mathematical forms, and often in practice a significant level of unrealistic optimism about the benefits that algorithms will produce in practice. The second is abstract essentialism, essentially trying to develop mathematical abstractions that represent real-world behaviors and attributes and values. And so often what this leads data scientists to doing is abstracting social problems into a mathematical representation. And often that leads to challenges of distorting the values and priorities of algorithmic systems and of the institutions where they're embedded, because we're relying on these mathematical representations that are necessarily oversimplifying the world that they're dealing with. And then finally, an assumption of objectivity and neutrality, which often leads data scientists towards relatively meager reform strategies. Generally, when data scientists try to promote social good, they're often really just optimizing existing systems rather than trying to aim for any sort of broad systemic change. And often the systems that they're optimizing are already ones where there are significant issues around discrimination and injustice. And so often what these algorithms do in practice is to entrench or legitimize unjust policies and existing inequalities rather than actually change these systems. So the alternative that I am developing in this project is a mode that I describe as algorithmic realism. There's theory that I'm building on from pragmatist philosophy and legal realism, which I won't get too much into for the sake of the talk, but I'm happy to talk more of those, of sort of where the ideas and the name of algorithmic realism are coming from. But broadly speaking, algorithmic realism is a data science methodology that situates algorithm design and evaluation around real-world impacts rather than mathematical formalisms. And so it aims to transform data science from a formal methodology focused on mathematical models into a more practical methodology for actually addressing real-world problems. And one way of summarizing this methodology is through what I call the pragmatic maxim for data science, which says that algorithms are instrumental tools for improving society, where the ultimate test of an algorithm is the impacts that it generates in practice. So in some sense, this is sort of maybe obvious and banal, and I think there maybe would be few data scientists who would disagree with this, although maybe some. But I think the real question and the contribution that I'm hoping to make here is to say, what does it actually look like to act on these principles that many would probably agree with, but the field, broadly speaking, does not actually follow through on these principles or on these ideas. And what I'm hoping to do with this project is to say, if we really are going to focus on real-world impact as the ultimate test of an algorithm's quality rather than what it does in formal mathematical terms, that actually requires a pretty fundamental shift in how data scientists are approaching their work, thinking about what a good algorithm is and evaluating an algorithm in practice. So this then leads to alternative orientations and practices from the approaches of algorithmic formalism that I was describing. The first is an emphasis on real-world consequentialism, where ultimately what we need to do if we're evaluating a system or building a system is to develop it with an eye towards what does it actually do in practice? What will happen or does happen once this algorithm is implemented into a police department, a welfare agency, any number of different environments, where often what happens is, the impacts of that system are not a straight path from the predictions that it provides, but actually are reflected through complex interactions where people may be ignoring the algorithm in certain situations, or interpreting it through their own lenses, or changing the types of values that they're actually prioritizing when they're making decisions. And so what's necessary are ways, and what I am talking about in the book, are ways of actually trying to orient our evaluation practices more towards these real world consequences, looking at things such as actually studying how people are interacting with the advice of a tool to determine what types of impacts it will have, rather than simply saying, the predictions achieve this level of accuracy, hence it will be effective. The second orientation is what I call contextual functionalism, where what we're really moving away from is an emphasis on abstraction as an end goal, or really the goal of trying to make our abstractions be as true to reality, to the end context that we're working in. And so thinking less about how real is this abstraction as the quality of the algorithm, and more about what role is it playing in the system that we're introducing it into. So thinking about, if we're trying to reform, look at one example would be teacher evaluation algorithms, where the primary emphasis for algorithm development has been, how do we optimally measure or capture teacher quality in a mathematical metric? And that's one way of thinking about the problem. I think another way of thinking about the problem would be, what is the role that algorithms can play in allowing us to enhance teachers' ability to perform well, or allow us to improve how school districts are training teachers, and so on. So thinking more about the goal that we're trying to achieve and the role of the algorithm in making a certain type of change, rather than saying, well, here's the problem, we can try to abstract this broad, complex ideal into a mathematical metric. And then finally is an orientation towards political conflict and political evaluation, with much more significant engagement in actually diagnosing the types of systemic challenges that society is facing, that governments are facing, so that data scientists can, rather than simply optimizing existing systems, can develop a better diagnosis for what is the actual social problem that exists here, what is a theory of change for addressing this problem, for improving policy in this area that isn't simply reinforcing existing inequalities. So one place that this leads is to an expansion or a different framing of the typical data science pipeline. So typically when we think about what is data science, the analysis is sort of restricted to this process where we take some data, we turn that data into a model, and then we use that model to make predictions. And the evaluation of the system is really limited to, what do those predictions say, what's their quality, and so on. And under algorithmic realism, there are actually additional stages that become a central part of this process and require as rigorous reasoning as what data scientists would typically emphasize in the model development stage. So really the starting point is a process of political diagnosis, sort of moving from a general orientation or general sense of, there's some problem here that is often motivating engineers to go do that's motivated by social good, but actually really trying to drill into what is the social issue, what are types of reforms for dealing with that social issue. That's really not even thinking about technology yet. That's just trying to understand the problem in a much deeper way. And then the next step is actually then doing problem formulation, thinking about the role that algorithms can play in addressing those problems and enhancing that theory of change. So trying to think about, if we have a way of thinking about what the problem is and what strategies social movements and legal scholars and others are proposing for reforming a welfare system or a police department or so on, then the question becomes, what are the roles that algorithms can play within that? And often really trying to, and part of my emphasis here is really decentering the algorithm as sort of the centerpiece of reform or the hero of the story, but looking more at how, by starting from that more non-technical emphasis on problems and reform strategies, then thinking about how algorithms can be slotted into that, but often in much more background ways than the algorithm being the core element of reform. And then finally, at the downstream end of things is a process of implementation and evaluation, where what we ultimately are caring about is not the predictions that an algorithm is spitting out, but the decisions and other types of effects that the algorithm is producing in practice. And often that's very different than what the algorithm is doing, because institutions are responding to these systems in different ways. And so there are a variety of practices, both before an algorithm is implemented, for trying to anticipate what will the algorithm do, how will people respond to it, how will this institution actually use it in practice, what sorts of effects will that have, and that ultimately being the place where, to determine that an algorithm is good or is advancing equality, the ultimate judgment is in those real world impacts rather than the algorithm, sort of the formalism of the algorithm itself, which is the typical emphasis. So that's sort of a very quick run through, perhaps overly rapid run through, of a bunch of broad ideas. That is sort of the overall framing of the project. I think it's helpful to just sort of give a sense of the overall structure of the book and sort of the argument, where the first two chapters are really laying out this theory, setting up the current state of practice, and then drawing on pragmatism and drawing on legal realism, and obviously lots of data science work to think about what could algorithmic realism be, and what would be the general orientations and practices of the field. And then the sort of next big chunk of the book is the broader applications of this theory. And so rather than, I'm not planning to go in the direction of running through a bunch of, say, policy domain case studies, but thinking more about how does this transform the efforts that already exist within data science to become a more responsible and ethical field? Because I think that many of these efforts, which have been pursued between AI ethics and algorithmic fairness and human-centered machine learning, although there have been certainly some benefits, they all embody the limitations that are embedded within algorithmic formalism. They all are approaching these ideals of ethics and fairness and human-centeredness in a way that is constrained by the emphasis on mathematical formalisms. And so chapters 3, 4, and 5 are thinking about how algorithmic realism would change research and practice around these areas. And then finally, the conclusion of the book is really thinking about what are the next steps for introducing this alternative into practice and actually making it more robust and more not just theory in a set of couple hundred pages on a text, but actually a thing that data scientists do. And so there I want to focus on reforms in pedagogy, research, and policy to actually help to enact some of these principles as a more commonplace culture of data science. Maybe just to wrap up, I do think, as I mentioned, there's a lot of ways that this overall framework, I think, can inform governance. And so, one way of thinking about that is through this pipeline. A lot of the regulatory efforts that have been developed to manage algorithms are really, in a similar way to what the engineers are doing, policymakers are often very focused on the model itself and the sort of the technical elements of the algorithm, looking at the data that they're using, the accuracy levels, and so on. And I think this framework can help to orient how governance also needs to be focused on all of these elements, democratizing the process of actually determining what types of problems algorithms are going to be used for, and also developing much more robust mechanisms for both requiring pre-deployment assessments of the likely downstream impacts and then actually monitoring those impacts once an algorithm has been deployed. And, that's a really difficult socio-technical challenge to do. But I think it's really essential. One sort of area of work that's feeding me into this is some research on the limits of human oversight policies. And so many, this is just one example, many regulations will point towards human oversight of algorithms to say, well, there are all concerns about errors and biases, but human oversight will ensure that there's discretion to avoid them. And if you actually look at empirical research on how people interact with algorithms, it pretty much disproves all of the assumptions that are going on in these policies. So the question is, how can we develop more robust regulatory standards that can better anticipate what the real world impacts of an algorithm will be when it's put into practice, and really put the burden on the engineers and the agencies that want to use these systems to demonstrate why the real world impacts will be justified above and beyond whatever the quality of the formal tool is. So that's really just a quick sense of also where I think this goes in terms of policy and regulation, and something in parallel projects that I'm hoping to develop out and think about much more. So let me pause there. That was sort of a very quick run through of some broad ideas where this is going. So I'm really interested in any reactions, both for folks who have read the introduction chapter on sort of their reactions to it and the writing itself, and then for those who haven't, really just sort of what this sparks or what challenges they foresee and what questions they'd want to see me grapple with in a project like this, and really anything else. So thanks so much for the attention. Looking forward to the rest of the time for discussion.
I'm going to take provocatory, go to the chat first. As political science who works on climate justice, I find that you can see it, right? I find this approach, or I couldn't tell if you could see it or not.
Now I can.
I find this approach very exciting. It's essential to integrate an analysis of politics and justice. Question is about implementation and adoption. How do you convince scholars or policymakers to use a more complex approach when motivation is driven by profit, cost reduction, and or efficiency? So I think you've heard this question before, if I recall. So if you'll take that one on, and then I'll go to the room.
No, that's a great question. And I think, there's two ways of answering this. One is that I can't, and to some extent, I am maybe punting on, by focusing on methodology, there's a little bit of punting on some of the broader systemic motivations for algorithms, right? Like this is not necessarily changing, this is not directly taking on the government agencies that are, actively deploying algorithms because they want to, legitimize budget cuts or make do with budget cuts, or, the tech industry corporations that are primarily, that are just focused on selling ads at whatever the cost. That's not, there's an element in which I'm not actually engaging with that. And I sort of think that to deal with the methodology, I sort of have to let the other aside. But I also think there is a place for regulation to actually enhance some of these practices. So like one question is, how do you get government agencies or data scientists to actually do some of these practices if they're not thinking of it on their own? One way to do that is to develop checks in the policy process that say, you're a government agency, you want to deploy a system, you need to show more. There's lots of conversations around algorithmic impact assessments and so on, expanding the scope of those to say, you actually need to show more about, why this problem is one that will benefit from an algorithm, or you need to actually demonstrate that you think the implementation procedure that you have of how you're combining algorithmic advice with human judgment will actually be beneficial. So I think there are ways to put checks in the regulatory process that can help to, at least in those types of policy settings, that help to actually require those types of practices in practice.
Jess was next.
All right, this is really interesting. And I actually have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to distill them down a little bit. And the first is sort of who the relevant actors are. So you go back and forth between data scientists and agencies and governments and big tech. And it seems like each one of those groups would interpret and use a theory about this differently and would have different incentives, right? Which then leads me to the sort of a little bit devil's advocate question of, are you creating yet another abstraction on which people can decide or not decide to respond to? Yeah. So you have this really well-specified sort of theoretical way of thinking about how we can account for the social possibilities related to algorithmic systems. And it seems like who is it, right, that this is meant to inform? And second of all, right, it's based on a set of assumptions that are, it's in my mind, potentially wonderfully optimistic.
Yeah.
Which is that, we could actually think that we could see what the potential downstream implications might be, and then try to lay them out and suggest that that will be convincing to a culture that is focused on metrics, right? And will then need some way of potentially verifying that potential. So we try to use 4 and 8 all the time, right? And it's just, we'll just tell you that this is what the potential consequences should be. We thought about them, unintended, likely unintended, and there's nothing we can do about that. So I know it's not quite a fair question. Right? So it's like any new policy intervention or domain, right? This is the ideal circumstance, right? And yet, in as much as someone can just write, well, this is what we expect to see, and that's kind of what we're asking them to do. What next? And then my final point, system error. You've read it or not read it?
I have not.
Okay, it's sort of an approach from Jeremy Weinstein, Rob Reich, and a few others at Stanford, looking at sort of how we can get young technologists to think about the social consequences of their technological interventions. I think it's a little bit different from what you're doing, but might be interesting.
Yeah. Thank you for the suggestion. Also, no, I think your questions are hitting on a lot of the key things that I'm grappling with and thinking about. So totally fair questions. I mean, the relevant actors that I'm really writing for is data scientists. I think that's really where I'm focused here. I actually started out trying to appeal to all of those audiences and with a much more balancing with policy. And I found that it just can't be one. I almost need to write that as a separate book or a separate set of papers, the more policy oriented things. Although, yeah, I was sort of blending between both here, certainly. In terms of abstract principles, one of the motivating goals is to actively avoid that. And because I've read a lot of that work. I've written work that is sort of limited by a sense of general principles. And then I've seen how, I have had conversations about my ideas from prior work on smart cities where I'm talking to people and they say, I totally agree with you. And then they start talking about their project and I'm like, that's so different than what I had in mind. So clearly something is too abstract in what I'm saying. And so this book is in many ways an effort to get to that next level beyond the sort of abstract and those sorts of things that are talked about to get into much more of like actual practices. And so because I mean, I wrote a conference paper about this theory a few years ago, and the problem is in 10 pages, all you can say is pretty much what I just said. And the goal of writing it as a book is to get much more practical. One thing I'm struggling with is that I'm trying to get more practical, but it's not a formalizable process. I'm both arguing against formalism, but also when you're thinking about engage with politics, engage with context, there's not a rubric or like a blueprint for how to do that. So the challenge is, can I get to a place that is practical enough for people to do it in a way that's not just checkbox or lip service, but is leaving open the room for local engagement with the actual political details and context and so on. So that's, something I have to figure out how to get to that point in the writing process. But that's definitely the goal. I'm very cognizant of avoiding that. And then finally, on the last point, I think there is an element of, I think in some ways I am writing with what could be called an overly optimistic approach. I mean, I think that there's just multiple dimensions to the problem. Like there's absolutely dimensions around bad incentives and people who don't want to do this work. But I do think there's a real need for trying to, I think one way of getting towards different outcomes and different processes is to say that there is another way of doing things. And I think that can be one part of a solution moving forward in policy or in research and maybe even in the tech industry, although I'm least optimistic there. So, I'm not directly changing some of the incentives, although I will talk a little bit about that in the last chapter of like, how do you change incentives in research practices? How do you change incentives through policy? But yeah, there's an element in which, I'm not doing that. That's a different project. And I would hope that I can do work on that some other time and other people work on that because they need to be operating in tandem.
Mike?
Okay, that helped a lot of sort of what your intended sort of audience is. Because I'm looking at this as a political scientist with sort of a more policy orientation. And it seems to me that part of what you're doing here is looking at this whole process of model building and using learning algorithms of different types. That is really a form of policy instrument or policy tool. Okay. And it might be useful to draw a little bit upon the way policy analysts look at the effects of policy tools and instruments. And I think what got me thinking in that way was one of the conclusions you have in this, when you expand this a little bit in the paper, is that you see the question of the problem definition as something that really needs to be generalized and examined much differently. It's not a problem of getting efficiency or getting accuracy or things like that, but it's something more that has connections to its social consequences and all that in the problem framing. Well, as it turns out in any sort of policy analysis, the policy stages approach is kind of the standard way of doing it. And the first stage is problem definition or formation. And to me, that's what I think you're grappling with is what is the nature of the problem? Is there something in the algorithm? Is there something in the data that the algorithm was built upon? Is there something wrong in society that is reflected in the data that then gets reflected in the algorithm? Sort of, and what's the problem? And I think that's tough. Okay. And it's always a question of framing and how you come at it. I think you've made a really important point here about the framing can't just be mathematical or in terms of utilitarian efficiency or things like that. There has to be a broader sort of kind of approach going in there. But what you haven't quite given is sort of, where are these data scientists going to go for sense of what is the important factors that they need to take account of, and that's where they get into engaging with this. And I'm sure in your smart cities work, you've seen that, and you've seen that people come in, policy actors come into these with very, very different expectations and very different interpretations even of what you're saying, and they're immediately starting to think about how they can turn this towards this sort of goal. And so that's just really tough, but I find it a fascinating project, but I think you need to engage a little bit more with the policy community than it sounds like you want to even be able to pull it off, because you've got to kind of help the data scientists know how they can frame their questions to the policymakers to help them define their own problems more efficiently. So there's sort of the data scientists by themselves can't frame the problem appropriately. And so there's got to be some sort of communication, but fascinating work.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And I think that's helpful. And I do think there, so maybe, yeah, I mean, just one follow-up would just be, where would you start with looking for literature in that area? Because I do think there are a lot of parallels of like, this is sort of algorithms as a tool of policymaking. So where would you have me start?
I'll send you some references.
That would be
But
great.
it's a classic thing in policy, but I've taught seminars on that stuff. So
Wonderful. I would
I'll
really
send you
appreciate
stuff.
some pointers on that.
And beware what you want, because I. I'm retired. I got nothing. I haven't started playing golf yet. I'll give you that, because I think that I have some stuff.
That would be, yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. What I really liked about what you're developing here is focusing on reasoning.
Mhm.
And you're focusing on how data scientists have a tendency, what their tendencies are to how to structure analyses, and you've outlined some things that come from it.
Mhm.
What struck me though, where I want to give some comment is late in your introductory paper, when you're talking about the lessons of pragmatism and realism. Now, in the paper, you've talked about the lessons from pragmatism, but you don't spell out what you think are the lessons from legal realism. And this is where I would want to flag for you. I'm not sure where you want to go with that, because legal realism itself is very controversial in the legal profession or with legal scholars. And in fact, I don't know if you're aware of an area called critical legal studies.
Yeah.
Okay, critical legal studies actually criticizes how legal realism developed. There's also been a lot of writings about people claiming that the school of legal realism that tended to develop in the 1920s and 30s actually is a misinterpretation of Oliver Wendell Holmes' work. So I'm not sure what your goal is in comparing to legal realism, whether it's to say, hey, they've successfully gone through this, or the fact that raising this has actually led to significant problems and still ongoing issues with how do we do this. So it's not clear to me where your analogy with legalism, and I just want to flag for you that depending upon where you want to go with it, it could be problematic because it's controversial among legal scholars itself. Also, the fact that getting into the complexity, I don't know if you've even heard of common good constitutionalism and all this other kind of stuff. I mean, you're opening a can of worms with a lot of schools of thought, okay? And which is not well settled. The other thing is drawing an analogy in the legal field. You got to recognize that's a different kind of system. And part of the reason why you have these different controversies or different ways of interpreting is because the functioning of the legal system is as a system that's supposed to be providing some kind of order for society, where it is important, for example, if something's retroactively applied or not, prospectively applied or not. It's a big deal. And so trying to make analogies to a legal system and how they have tried to reason and go through that is a different can of worms than data scientists, and starts going towards the road of what Mike was saying about understanding policymaking system. There are certain attributes and the functioning of a legal system that's different and inherently means, what do we mean by rule of law and all these other kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons why legal realism is sometimes viewed as problematic. Even if you did a quick Google search just for the hell of it, I did, just to say, for example, what's the key difference between critical legal studies and legal realism? It will say legal realism is more focused on the role of judges and the judicial process in shaping the law, whereas critical legal studies is more concerned with the broader social and political context in which the law operates. Okay, so some might argue, and I just happened to go to law school in the late seventies when critical legal studies was,
Right, was the thing.
you know, kind of
Yeah,
like really coming out.
right.
And so, so even between these two, even though they are both forms of realism, if you
Mhm.
will, they focus differently on what they think the nexus of what the analysis or reasoning or processes are. So it just flagged for me, it wasn't clear
Mhm.
what thought you, or what you had in mind with legal
Yeah.
realism, and depending upon what you want to do with it, or it may hurt or help you,
Right.
is all I'm trying to flag for you.
Yeah, no, that's
So-
very helpful. And I mean, I do have a sort of longer section on legal realism.
And I haven't seen that yet, so I don't know if you want to share that with me.
I would love
I give you my
to,
card,
once
yeah.
I have a draft of that. I'd love to get back in, but I think, so there is a deeper engagement with legal realism that is happening in the next chapter. So that, that is getting more into the theory. I mean, to me, what I'm interested in is the parallels in sort of the shift away from formalism to a pragmatism inspired way of reasoning about how to make sense of what the law is and how to evaluate the law. And so there's a little bit maybe of a sort of threading a needle of drawing inspiration without trying to make a one-to-one comparison, because I'm not trying to go too rigid in the point, but I think it's helpful and there's a way in which you could almost maybe strike it out and just rely on the pragmatism. But I think it's very helpful for saying, okay, pragmatism is still pretty broad and pretty philosophical. What does it look like when these types of ideas become embedded into a more applied practice that is thinking about, about a sort of form of social engineering or social practice. And so that's really what I'm trying to think about, is part of how do I get to those alternative orientations from formalism is by seeing what were some of the core shifts that occurred within legal realism, those shifts away sort of towards the ideas that I talk about around contextual functionalism and real world impacts and so on, is sort of thinking about some of those lessons of how that developed in legal realism and how that has then trickled into some of the follow-on movements.
Well, I would make a suggestion then, and then I will give airtime to other people because I know they're
Yeah.
waiting. You might consider a different analogy with a field that's been more struggling with its mathematization, and that's economics. And there's some books that I can, now that I'm retired, I've had the time to read, but that have gone into, in fact, the challenges that's happened that actually economics is viewed as having become too mathematized.
Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
And how that field and framing it that way has infiltrated the policy debate. It's actually got a stranglehold in some ways in how we define problems, which you made one reference to economics.
Mhm.
But now how there's been a push within the field,
Mhm.
and it's still struggling with how to move away from
Right.
the mathematical rational man actor to better take into account
Mhm.
human nature,
Right.
this kind of thing. And so they're struggling with how to implement or bring back. In fact, some of the research shows that, in fact, economics had a more of an institutional period,
Mhm.
which was more empirically based, institutional, and it's in the 20th century, latter part, that got moved away to more mathematical. It needs to recover some of its institutional roots.
Mhm.
That might possibly also be another area that might actually have more of an alignment with data science because it's been so mathematized.
Mhm.
And I can talk with you further about that, but that's just a suggestion
Yeah, thanks.
to think about when you're trying to
Build
convince
analysis. Yeah.
your community by looking at other communities.
Mhm. Great.
Doc.
Oh, yeah. I love crowding.
a lot of
Looking
docs
over
up
there. There's no shortage of doctors.
Multitasking.
Yeah.
I love grounding this in the real world. And for most, everybody who has a connection in the real world, their experience with algorithms, which is now
Mhm.
a common word, is with Facebook, Google, Amazon, every subscription TV service that gets them wrong.
Mhm.
Okay, that's A. B is the best jobs for data scientists right now are in business.
Mhm.
Okay, so we have neighbors who are academics, they left the academy, they're working for Meta.
Mhm.
We know other people working for Meta and Facebook and the rest of these guys that are greatly morally conflicted right now. They're with you on this thing. So my advice to you is like, don't ignore that audience. The third thing is, you tend to think in the academy that policy is like a steering wheel or guardrails, when most of the time it's people on the side of the road yelling at traffic, publishing something long at a rest stop. So I really think you've got an opportunity on the business side of this thing.
Ethak.
I didn't raise my hand. I thought go to Asaf.
I'm happy to go next. So one I think follows from Jess's comment at the beginning, which is since you're so interested in the methodology here, I think that you'll have to engage in the question of information deficiencies, information asymmetries, because so much of the framework you're putting forward is data intensive. It asks a lot of questions that will require me to possess knowledge about how this will be applied, how it will be utilized, about the problems in society and so on. And different actors, so that goes to the actors side, different actors will possess different levels of knowledge. There's also a timing issue of when do I assess? And so what is the right time to assess? Am I assessing at different points throughout time in the life cycle of a particular algorithm? And again, who possesses the knowledge in each particular moment by each particular actor, and what incentive structures are for me to acquire that information. And so I do think that there's a story there on the methodology and the information side. The other thing we talked about in the office before the session, I really do think plays a role in this too, is the industries who will be utilizing the algorithms at the back end of it, needing to conduct their own independent ethical assessment that they have failed to do on the use of predictions. And so what we had talked about, and I think you had described it well when you answered a question of mine, which is to say there are particular industries who have worked with predictions before. There are particular industries who have never touched predictions and are being introduced to predictions through algorithms. And I think that dichotomy is an interesting one in assessing what they know or don't know, understand or don't understand on how predictions work. And even within the industry that has worked with predictions or now relying on algorithms, they have failed. So the one particular industry that I'm passionate about is espionage, is intelligence agencies. They have failed to engage with the ethics of their profession well enough to develop a robust framework to how to think about predictions and how they work, what they do well, what they don't do well, why we need it, why they're inevitable, why we can give them up, that the algorithm side then builds on it. And again, that's a different industry to be working out these questions, but it will then need to feed back information to the data scientists and the engineering side who's contracted to develop a particular solution. Those were my two random thoughts on.
No, and that's great. And I think just very briefly to let other folks get in, I think part of this is almost giving structure to, we have calls for interdisciplinary data science and participatory data science. And I think that's an essential component. And part of this is trying to give structure to how do you do that? And what are the types of goals that you're trying to accomplish by reaching out to non-engineers and people in communities who are being affected by policies and so on? Like, what are the sort of shifting the questions that they're trying to collectively answer? Because I agree, the goal is not to say data scientists need to know all of these things on their own. That's not effective or desirable strategy.
Gustavo? I'm almost caught up with all the answers. Like fast. Jamie, you're next.
Okay, so
Gustavo?
pretty fast. So it's with some these ideas you may run into a serious risk from my perspective. It's like if you focus on the social scientist as the main actor. So essentially you're pushing this person to end up being 1/3 philosopher, 1/3 social scientist, 1/3 engineer. I think you most likely end up with a bad moral sciences, kind of a bad philosopher, a bad social scientist, and a bad engineer. Yeah. I think it was very useful to have people that are extremely focused on some activities. So think, for example, in, force Venus Williams to do 1/3 of her time in basketball, 1/3 in philosophy. So there is a lot of value that people specialize on one thing. And then in general, I think there is a lot of value to have organizations with clear goals and not dispersed goals. A lot of political science on the room. So the arrow impossibility theorems comes again and again to my mind. It's a very good idea to have like limited number of goals. And then two more comments is one, if I think we are talking about an entity trying to deploy an algorithm, then I think there are two issues there. So one is a legal thing, and I believe the key question there is who is liable for what? That's the key thing. And then the second one related to if we are talking about a political agency, the government deploying some of those things, the key thing is like, well, how we're going to make accountable. So it's like, it's political liability. And then essentially all you are saying is an old-fashioned question of transparency. So essentially, I would recommend you to read all the literature in political science, how transparency works, because essentially what you are saying is, essentially we want this to be more transparent to voters or special interest groups can punish those agencies that deploy the wrong algorithms.
Yeah, and I think in part there's already the problem of the sort of like person who is bad engineer, bad philosopher. I think that's part of, as data scientists are doing this work, they're already doing they're sort of being the engineer who is a bad social scientist or bad philosopher. And so part of it, the goal is to think about both how do you maybe not know all of the answers, certainly, but how do you know what are the right questions to ask, or adding some of those checks into the process and recognizing at least. And some of it, I think they can become better at through better training and research goals and all of that. But again, the goal is certainly not to, have like every data scientist become this interdisciplinary unicorn who knows everything. And so I think it is a challenge to sort of figure out how to combine all of those different expertises
You're
together.
talking about like building a community
Mhm.
so that they would collaborate with people who do, right?
Yeah.
So is that part of what?
Like the workshop.
Yeah. Is that part of what you were saying? Making clear that you don't have to get it all inside one head, but. Yeah.
I mean, I'm afraid that if any person developing a new technology has to think about all the social consequences, we may run into serious problems. I prefer to have like more, use our political institutions to check the effects of those technologies rather than put internal controls in whoever is developing. That's a complicated way of thinking. Yeah. That's
I'm gonna go next because Dr. Green will be here for lunch and we're running out of time. I saw the hands pop up. So he will actually be here in person for a bit, and Jamie's on Zoom, so she's stuck on Zoom, and if we don't get to her, she'll get hosed. So, Jamie, can you unmute, or do you want me to read your question? Okay.
I can read my question, and you guys are lucky I'm in Oklahoma because it's hard to hose you from here.
Go ahead and your question.
Right. Ben, I just wanted to pose this question. Thank you for your fascinating talk, by the way. You described the motivating goal as one of improving society. And this question, I think, touches on a lot of the conversation that's been going on about the difference between fact and value, which is very much a Bloomington School conversation. So my question about this idea of improving society, who determines what the particulars of an improved society looks like?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, again, this is where there's both a policy angle to it, but also why, to the prior question, the answer is not to just say data scientists get to decide this on their own, because part of what the problems have been data scientists just sort of just thinking that they have all the answers, that it's easy to come up with the answers and that they can move forward from there. So part of this is even just prompting them to grapple with the fact that this is hard and that there is a challenge and it's not actually straightforward to just say, here's, this is a problem and social good is just this sort of easy thing to come to. And so I think, the goal is, again, not to say that there is an answer for them to arrive at, but to build in processes for actually prompting them to really justify how they're defining what a good society is through engaging with either policymakers or communities and so on, to actually have to really dig into that element of the process. So, the answer is neither that I get to decide. It's not that data scientists get to decide. There's not a sort of straightforward maybe answer to give there, but I do think it is about putting more onus on engineers to justify that they've really thought about it, because right now there is, again, just from a methodological element, like that's not even really talked about. It's sort of just seen as either that algorithms are inherently good, or that it's actually just very easy to decide that, to come up with an application that will be good for society. And so, pushing back on that and engaging with like this, it's actually hard, and it's will require more work to make those judgments.
We are officially out of time. There are still tons of hands in the room. Please. We'll be here the rest of through lunch and after, and ask a lot of questions. Apologies for not getting to everyone. It was immediate. I'm like, really cool. And congratulations for having such an inviting paper. I'm sure, I guess.
Yeah, but yeah, no, I don't think.
Yeah, I also think we'll.
You can't go, I can't.
There is an Ostrom room. Yeah.